Hello, my name is Dejan Boshkov, Grandmaster from Bulgaria. Today we continue our series on the typical endgames that arise from the Berlin endgame, so-called Berlin endgame. After the pawn endgames, we're going to see a pure knight endgames. Knight endgames with only a pair of knights. Most of you probably know that the knight endgames are very close to the pawn endgames, which means that in that case, this should be also pretty grim for the second player, as again, like in the most endgames, Berlin endgames, he has a pawnless on the king's flank, and on the queen's flank they're practically equal. The first endgame that we're going to see is a game between two not very famous players, as white is playing Bakr and as black is Singil, and that was played in Izmir Open 2008. As we can see, white has achieved most of the things that he wanted to. He also advanced some of his pawns on the king's flank. But now black is threatening moves like knight d4, knight b4 to start attacking the pawns on the queen's flank. That's why white first needs to centralize his knight, attacking the pawn on c5, forcing black to defend it with b6, as otherwise, if he goes for a counterattack, there'll be too many pawns hanging. And also c3 was possible in that case. So b6 is more or less forced, and white is cementing the position on the queen's flank with the move c3. It will be impossible now for black to achieve anything substantial on the queen's flank, neither he can make a pass pawn. What will be the next thing that white would like to do? Naturally, he would like to advance the pawns on the king's flank and to create a pass pawn. This is the place where he is stronger, and of course he would like to push the pawns there. But which one? If he pushes the g pawn, then the f5 square will be very weak, and the knight will always have an excellent blockading square on f5. That's why it's recommendable to advance the f pawn instead. For this aim, the best thing that he can achieve, just a bit of a thinking in schemes exercise that's going to be, well, then the best thing to do is to place a king on e4. From e4, that's ideal. The king will defend the e5 pawn, and he will also help for the advance of the f pawn. And after that, white will see where exactly his knight belongs. It can be either on g3 or on d3, on e3, he will decide for himself. But the ideal setup is to place a king on e4. King e8, and he played knight g3. This is logical in accordance with the plans, but actually he had even a better plan in this situation. He could have played c4, somewhat surprising, but first of all, that pawn is taking away the d5 and b5 squares, and also white would like to place his knight on c3. While on c3, well, okay, black is also activating his knight in that case. It can come to d4, but the point is that from d4 it attacks nothing, while the knight on c3 is ready to jump on b5, attacking the pawn on c7 and forcing the black king to defend it, which will ease the breakthrough on the king's flank. Here are some possible lines. For example, king d7 immediately, f5, already threatening in many cases to play f6, and after the exchange of the pawns, he can also create a second pass pawn with a breakthrough, g5, and then two pass pawns on the 6th rank will be too much for black to bear. That's why black either has to take, or in case of king e7, here comes one of the points behind the setup with c4, knight is going to b5, forcing the exchange of the knights. And the pawn endgame, as we know it, is simply won for white. One thing that we shouldn't forget is that in case of a4, we should block those pawns, so there are no breakthroughs like a3 and c4 coming past pawn in some lines. After that, white is going to exchange on e6, put black into Zugzwang, and penetrate on f5, g6 to come and take these two pawns. So if king e7 is not working, he is more or less forced to exchange on f5. G takes f5, and now if c6 to take away the squares from the knight will find another way to attack the pawns from a4. Knight a4, king c7, e6, and there is no salvation against the idea knight takes b6 followed by e7 and e8 queen. The defense will stretch in that case. The king cannot really handle the situation by itself. And if he doesn't make committal pawn moves, if he just waits, let's say knight c6, bringing the knight closer, eventually to help the king save the day, there comes e6, king e7, knight b5 again, the same old trick, forcing the king to go away. And now a very typical break. Now that the pieces on the queen's flank, they are too far away from the other one, and white is temporarily sacrificing a pawn but activating the king to the maximum. After g takes f6, king f5, king e7, knight takes c7, knight is coming next on d5, and white is basically winning all the pawns. For example, check, king g6, f5, the only way to create some counterplay, f4, but the knight is quick enough to stop that pawn to take it, then king g7, and either the h-pawn is going into a queen, or the knight can return to d5 and to come for the b6 pawn. And this would have been the clearest way to win the game for white. However, the way that he chose in the game is also not spoiling the win. Knight g3 is natural move. Anyway, he wants to place the king on e4, and after that to push f5. a4, a3, very typical setup. We talked about it before, although in the pure pawn endgames, the pawns were placed on b3, c4, and a4 to gain some space, not only to stop the breakthroughs, but to gain some space. Here this is also working very well, not letting the black pawns to be pushed forward. Knight c6, king e4, knight a5. He's trying to keep the white pieces busy and eventually to create some counter chance on the queen's flank. King d3, of course white is not in a hurry to push the f-pawn. It's much more important to stop any counterplay. f5 has nowhere to go. That's why king d3. King f7, that's the passive defense. Most stubborn would have been to play b5. The idea is that after c4 check, king d2, knight b3 check, let's say that black achieves this position, at some moment he would like to jump on d3, either via c1 or c5, and then to attack the pawn on b2. This would be probably the best defense, but I doubt that he would have saved the game anyways. Play might continue king e7, f5, takes, king d7, and as the king is very close to the opponent's pawns, it's very easy for white to go on the king's flank at once. King f4, king e7, check, takes with the knight. Furthermore, trying to consume that pawn on h6, king e6, knight g8. Finally, black is going for the counter-attack. Sorry, the knight is heading for d3, not for c3. Takes, check, and now either takes the b or the e pawn. It doesn't really matter. White managed to create a distant pass pawn while still keeping those on the king's flank alive, and this is the most dangerous pawn for the knight. This is just one for white. He's going to deflect the black's pieces on the king's flank and come on the queen's flank to grab all the pawns. Anyways, black had tried to do that, because in the game he loses without any resistance. So in the game, instead of b5, he tried king f7, c4 now, very important move, not letting him already to move anything, because if c6, then the knight is coming to d6 with a tempo, and there won't be b5, the knight will be defending that square. Knight c6, knight comes to e2. The knight is heading this time for the a4 pawn. Knight wants to come to c3 and to take that pawn, or to b5 to attack the c7 pawn, like we have seen it before. That's why black tried counterplay on the king's flank, somehow trying to clarify the situation or to exchange as many pawns as possible. But this just led to a further collapse of the position for the second player. f5, black is more or less forced to take that pawn. If he plays king f7, there is knight f4 coming. Let's say that he starts counterplay on the queen's flank. But the problem is that even though he takes a lot of pawns here, his pawns a4 and c5 are too far away from the promotional squares. That's why white will prevail in the pawn race. His pawns are also moving with tempos. e6 check. Knight is improved with the check. The other pawn is improved with the check. You see how easy those pawns are rolling. And now king f4 with the idea f7, and after that, soon after that, e7 will follow. King moved to f4 not to allow knight d6 with the check. The finish could be knight takes a3, f7, king g7, knight takes b6, followed by knight d7 and f8, queen. That's inevitable. You see how far the pawns, the black pawns, are from the promotional squares. So he has to take on f5, but then white now will have a pair of powerful passed pawns. G takes f5, king f7, knight f4. And not only a pair of powerful passed pawns, but also they are far away advanced and they have sufficient support. So basically all the pieces are helping them on their way to the promotion. c6, king d3 was played, defending the c4 pawn. Okay, there were other ways to win. Knight b3 now, and in the game knight e2 follow, and he won in a few more moves. The easiest way to win would have been simply to push the pawns though. e6 check, knight g6, preparing e7 and f6, and the black knight is too far away to do anything. Knight a5, e7 and f6. The pawns are just rolling. Knight b7 check, forcing the king to go into a passive position, and finally the king is coming to help to promote the pawns. King e4, the threat is king f5, king e6 and f7 mate. So knight d6 is forced, but after king f4 black is in Zugzwang. He can barely move anything. If the h pawn is moving, then king g5, the king is taking that pawn, then is coming to g7 and f7, f8, queen is coming. The knight cannot really move because king f5 and king e6 is coming and f7 mate. And finally, in case of b5, white just takes the pawn on c6 and comes king e5 and king e6 anyways with mate to follow on f7. This is quite a typical scenario for the pure knight endgame. We have seen the dangers that black is experiencing in the pure knight endgame. The only way for him to save the half point is if he can eventually create a successful blockade. If he doesn't have any counterplay on the queen's flank, this is the only chance that he has. And this is exactly what happened in the game Vučković as white against Tu Huang Tong from the Dresden Olympiad 2008. White is having a defended passed pawn on e6. But despite of that, after the exchanges that happen in the game, king takes f4, the position that arises is a draw. And that draw was agreed immediately after knight d6, knight d1. Why? Because he has no breaking in. There are no breaking points. The pawns on the queen's flank are defending all the critical squares. These pawns on f5 and on h5 are preventing white from attacking anything with the knight. Indeed, he can transfer a knight on g6, but what comes next? That knight is not attacking anything. Black is just going to keep his knight on d6, defend the f7 square and keep the king on the squares e8 and f8 or e8 and d8. And that will be all. That's a perfect blockade for black, and he was happy here to save the half point. The last sample that we are going to see is Carlsen as white against Harlov. They played at the European Championship in Warsaw in 2005. We said that black is counting on a blockade, but usually it's very difficult for him to handle the blockade. And in that case, he has a very strong piece. He has a very good king on d5. And imagine if white had a bishop on f2 rather than a knight, then black will be completely out of danger in this position. Black will really keep the blockades. It will be impossible for white to break in. But with the knight able to switch places and to turn the colors from white going into black squares, it's impossible to keep that position with the king on d5, and Carlsen managed to prove it. First he played c3, stopping the motion of the black pawns, but also what is very important, taking away the d4 square from the king. After b3 he kept the position close with a3, and the next part in his plan was to bring the knight on e3 and to kick away the king from the active position on d5. This will also allow him to place his king perfectly on e4, and this is something that he would love to do. Knight e7, check, and king e4. The ideal setup was reached, but white still needs to be very careful when he is pushing his pawns. For if he pushes f5 immediately, which seems like a killer, there will be exchanges, of course, and if black takes on f5, he's just lost. He's a pawn down into the pawn endgame. We know how he's losing. But there is a problem with the white's position, and this is the b3 pawn, that it has a lot of energy inside. And here a6 will be met with a typical strike, knight takes c3, something that we have to be aware always in positions like that, and the tables will be turned in black's favor actually now, as b2 and b1 is coming with a check, the promotion. So Carlsen has to be careful, and he has to prepare this f5 breakthrough. The good thing for him is that black has nowhere to go. That's why knight f1, king b5, knight e2. The knight is traveling to a better position. The knight arrived on d4, forcing black to go passive with his pieces, furthermore strengthening the position. So the king has to go to d7, and now he played f5. After the exchanges, black played c5, hoping to somehow confuse his opponent. The thing is that now there is no d5 square available for the knight. The king is protecting that square. The pawn endgame is lost. We know it, but also the knight endgame is already lost with the king too far away from the pawns. Knight e3 is just taking the pawns. That pawn first, then the a4 pawn will be lost, etc. White is completely winning. That's why he played c5, and here Carlsen, I presume that he was in time trouble. He just missed an immediate win. He could have won by playing f6, and furthermore f7, that pawn was just getting promoted. Anyways, the way that he played was also very, very good. He played e6, even though, okay, it wasn't very good because he was not winning on the spot. It's good for us to understand better these endgames. Actually, he could have lost the half pawn here. Knight f4, knight e7. Still, there are a lot of problems for the second player, despite the fact that he has an extra pawn, as the white pieces are too active. King d8, king d6. So, basically speaking, black just tried to hold the zone with the knight. However, he cracked. I presume that he was also in time trouble. Here he played knight c6, and that's passing back the win into white's hands. He had to torture the opponent's king with giving him checks furthermore from d5. Again, taking the pawn is not good. The king is not supporting the e6 pawn, and black has this typical trick. And if he plays king f7, then g4, keeping that knight busy, forcing the knight to block the pawn, and knight e7. So these two pieces are dealing well with the king and the pawn on g4 is keeping busy the knight on g3. This should have ended in a draw. But Kharlov instead played, after king f6, he played knight c6, which gave time for white to take the pawn on g5 and to play a very typical endgame with an extra e-pawn. King e7, knight f4. What follows next will be king to f5, and then check either on g6 or on d5. And furthermore, that king would be happy to come and to take the pawns on the queen's flank, something that we have already seen in the pawn endgames. king d6, king f6, knight e7, hoping for a blockade. But this is not really working. King f7, knight has to move. Okay, here they just repeated the moves twice. That's why I'm sure that they were in time trouble. And Carlsen found another way for the knight, another route to make it happy. Knight g8 check, king e7, knight e7. He could have tried to go into the endgame for some counterplay quickly to come to take the b2 pawn, but this is not working. After king takes g8, king e5, knight e3, king e4, the knight is taking that pawn, and then he is just in time to take the other pawn and to defend the b2 pawn from far away, let's say something like that. The king cannot really attack that knight on a4, so white is simply winning. And what happened into the game? He lost in another way. After king g7, he came back knight e7, king f7, so the knight is no longer going on g8 with a check, and a white won an important tempo to place the knight on e3. Knight c6, king f6, and it appeared that if the knight goes back to e7, white simply plays knight e3, knight g8, and he uses the same maneuver to win a tempo. King f6, this triangulation, then he takes either the pawn on c4 or just exchanges the knight with knight f5, let's say like that, and the king is coming for the pawns on the queen's flank. So e6 pawn is also winning, especially if it has enough support by the king and the knight. And in general, the general advice for the second player, if he doesn't really have a good counterplay on the queen's flank, if he cannot create a pass pawn there, it's better that he just avoids those knight endgames in the Berlin.